Hello students, today we are going to talk about the various differences that are evident in the construction of Mauryan pillars, about which we have already discussed in my earlier lecture titled Mauryan Pillars. And our aim in today's lecture would be to study in detail both the outside and Indian influences on these art pieces, also known as Ashokan pillars. We begin by a brief reference to the source of the culture from which Ashoka drew his inspiration. From 500 BC and the ensuing 170 years, the pulse of Asiatic culture throbbed in what was then the fertile land of Persia, and as a result, there developed in the capital cities of that great empire, the nearest to India, a classical art school composed of Pharaohic, Hellenic, Iranian element of a distinctively effective character. This school was probably partially dispersed by Alexander's conquest of Persia, together with the downfall of the Achaemenid dynasty in 330 BC. But unsettled period which then ensued was rapidly followed by the extension of the Macedonian Empire in the east, by means of Greek colonies such as the Bactria, which brought the full force of Hellenism to the very borders of modern India. What actually happened to the exponents of the original Achaemenid school under such conditions can only be a matter of conjecture, but that they are their successor continues to flourish under the intelligent patronage of the Asiatic Greeks, producing works with still more marked Hellenistic features cannot be doubted. It was at this stage of the movement that the Indian Emperor Ashoka conceived the project of erecting his imperishable and symbolic monuments to the Buddhist faith, and instinctively turned to the descendants of the workmen who had already shown such proficiency in their construction of the stately palaces of the Persian kings. To attain his object, the Mauryan monarch adopted the common practice of royal art patronage and brought into his service a group of experienced foreign artists of a sufficiently adaptable nature to put into effect his progressive ideas. Historical instances of such a procedure are numerous, but some of those which account for particular character of the Achaemenid East of Eastern Persia and in the course of time of that of Ashokan school have a direct bearing on the style which afterwards appeared in the Buddhist India. In these circumstances, it is not difficult to account for the form and character that the giant pillar and other lithic productions of Ashokan period assumed. From the columned halls reared under the orders of Achaemenid kings, form their sculptured reliefs and their inscriptions on the rocks, the Indian monarch obtained some of his inspirations. And from the rank of those who produced them, he secured the skilled artificers to aid him in his project. In short, it may be presumed with some degree of certainty that, attracted by the emperor's assured patronage, there was eventually gathered in a quarry workshop near Chinar in Bihar a small group of imported workmen trained in Greco-Persian traditions and engaged to collaborate with a number of selected Indian craftsmen to fashion the first dressed stone object to be produced on Indian soil. Of the achievement of this composite school established by Ashoka, the freestanding pillars are unquestionably the most notable. Finding expression from wood in another and more lasting material such as dressed stone is a decisive step in the cultural evolution of people. But the manner in which this step was taken under Ashoka's direction and the result it produced are both of more than ordinary significance. Appearing as these sculptured forms do, fully matured at a time when Indian art was still in its infancy and without any previous preparation is a phenomenon which needs some explanation. There can be no doubt that the motivation came from outside. The very sudden use of stone, and that at once for monumental art of large designs and huge proportions, and the quick process of evolution from primitive to conscious, civilized and cultured form and appearance, from tribal to imperial outlook that is evident in the total effect of the columns point unmistakably in that direction. It has been repeatedly suggested, not without reason, that this unnecessary motivation and inspiration came from Iran of the Achaemenian emperor. Some have even suggested that Mauryan columns are but Indian adaptations of the Achaemenian prototype. As repeatedly attempts have been made to deny the alleged extent of depth, not again without a certain amount of justice, but few have seriously doubted that the West Asiatic art forms in general and Achaemenian impetus and inspiration directly and in particular were at work at the root. Nor against the background of what we know of Mauryan relationship with Hellenic East and Mauryan court ideology and tradition deeply tinged with Achaemenian ideas was such impetus and inspiration unlikely, especially when we take into account the extent of Achaemenian influence on Ashokan epigraphs, his imperial ideas and policy, and the conception of the Mauryan pillared hall. But the difference that separate the Mauryan columns from the Achaemenian ones are also considerable and must not be lost of sight. The stone columns of the Mauryan pillared halls were evidently without capitals, whereas the columns of the pillared halls of Persepolis are provided with more or less elaborate capitals. Achaemenian columns stand either on bell-shaped bases or on plain rectangular blocks of plain circular moldings, while the independent Mauryan columns have no base at all. The bell form that is supposed as supporting base in Persian columns serves as capital in Mauryan ones and makes altogether a different aesthetic effect. And moreover, in form, shape and appearance, the Mauryan bell, which along with the Achaemenian may have originally been derived from stylized lotus design and which may have been a common art motif in both Indian and Iranian art heritage, is a long way off from the Achaemenian bell, in which a ring of leaves and petals play an important part in the decoration of the upper end of the motif, and which has no bulge whatsoever in the middle that makes the Mauryan bell so gainly and conspicuous. Mauryan columns are all plain and circular, but evidently they did not adopt the type from Achaemenian unfluted ones, which had for ordinary purpose been discarded by Achaemenian themselves. A funeral mound at Laurianandangarh has yielded to the excavator's spade a plain and circular piece of a column carved out of Silla wood. Such columns are in our literature known as thuna, and the primitive animal standards were evidently comprised of such thuna columns. It is not unlikely that the Mauryan shafts was derived from such wooden originals. The assumption derives further support from the fact that Achaemenian shafts are indeed built of separate pieces or segments of stones and evidently present the essential character of the work of a mason, while the Mauryan shaft is one piece which pertains to the character of the work of woodcarver or carpenter. The Achaemenian capitals, crowned with a cluster of stylized palm leaves after the old Egyptian manner, and formed of either of two semi-bulls or unicorns or lions seated back to back, or of an upright or inverted cup, and the whole crowned with projecting double volutes, have nothing whatsoever in common with the Mauryan capitals, which consist, as we have seen, of simply a bell formed of stylized lotus petal. The crowning abacus and the round and independent animal motif of Mauryan columns are also altogether absent from Achaemenian examples. The result achieved by this almost thorough transformation is altogether different. The Achaemenian column, intended invariably as part of a large architectural conception, is composed of much too many component parts, presenting harsh contrasts and looking complex and complicated, while the Mauryan columns, intended to produce the effect of an independent monument, at least in its latest and best specimen, is simpler, more harmonious in conception and execution, and gives the feeling of greater stability, dignity and strength, born perhaps of other primitive and elemental origins. The capital at Nandangarh, which appears slightly stunted in its proportion, while the abacus and other features are somewhat different, so that it is possible that this particular example was an early and experimental effort. There may be some symbolic connection between the campaniform capital and the bell, as this is conventional form, was used early in Indian decoration, and it also figures prominently in the temple ritual. But the boldly marked fluting dissection, of which is unmistakable, has an undoubted foreign origin. Exactly similar fluting being not uncommon on Persian and Greek pillars, as may be seen on the capitals of the Ionic temples of Apollo. Above the Ashokan capital is a circular abacus, having its broad edge carved with ornamental borders of a special character. On some of these are repetitions of Buddhist emblems, as for example the goose, but on the other, as in the case of Bull capital at Rampurva, there are such well-known conventional motifs as the honeysuckle and palomete, the bead and fillet, and the cable moulding, each one of direct Hellenic extraction. It is, however, in the massive Buddhist composition poised above the abacus that the greatest imagination has been shown, and symbolism utilized to its utmost extent. Most of the superstructures consist of figures of animals, each of which has a mythological meaning. Together, they symbolize the four quarters of the universe, the elephant being the guardian of the east, the horse of the south, the bull of the west, and the lion of the north. All four animals are carved in relief on the abacus at Sarnath, by far the finest of the entire group, evidently signifying that although this pillar was primarily associated with the north by its position and conventional group of lions above, it was also intended to commemorate by the addition of the great wheel which these beasts sport, the proclamation of the good law of the Church of the Four Quarters. Such were the Buddhist interpretations, but not a little of this animal symbolism was drawn in the first instance from Vedic sources. The Rig Veda gives the place of honor among all wild beasts to the lion, which roamed in the jungles of India until comparatively recent times, while a swift or galloping horse represented the sun, and the bull Indra, the sky god, all of which are illustrated on the abacus of the Sarnath capital. From this and other evidences, it is clear that much of the primitive Buddhist symbolism as expressed in the art was a continuation of the Vedic mythology. It is somewhat curious that the lions in Mauryan art are always and invariably done in a manner that seems already to have been fixed by convention. Their formal pose and appearance, the rendering of their volume, bold and vigorous but stylized, their plastic conception in one word, and the sense of form as revealed in them are on the whole the same and already predetermined. The trend of the style is already evident in Basara Bakra lion, and it is within the limits of the given trend that the style evolves and advances in treatment and execution. The aesthetic vision and imagination and the attitude and outlook of the artist do not mark any definite change. This is partly true as well as for the lion, the horse and the bull on the Sarnath abacus. It raises the presumption that this style and convention came from outside, where they were already fixed and well established. The horse on the Sarnath abacus in its movement modeling recalls the two horses in the relief on the sarcophagus of the Amazons. The vigorous striding lion and the bull recalls well-known Achaemenian prototypes of the same style and convention. Even the elephants on the abacus have a distinct kinship with the horned elephants on the early coins of Seleucids, though the Sarnath elephant is much less conventional and shows somewhat a different sense of form and treatment. The aesthetic vision and imagination and the conventional style and fixed expression just spoken of are most evident in the crowning lions. Compared with later figural sculptures in the round of yakshas and their female counterparts or the reliefs of Bharat, Sanchi and Bodh Gaya, they are represented by these crowning lions belong to an altogether different world of conception and execution, of style and technique, altogether much more complex, urban and civilized. They have nothing archaic or primitive about them, and the presumption is irresistible that the impetus and inspiration of this art must have come from outside. Marshall therefore argued for Hellenistic plastic tradition as practiced by Greco-Bactrian artists. From what we know of the Hellenistic colonies in West Asia and the part they played in modern India, it is possibly, nay, highly probable that Hellenistic art and culture played also a very dominant role in Mauryan art. The Mauryan lions, indeed, in their aesthetic conception and plastic vision, in their conventional modeling, advanced visualization, feeling or volume, and sense of form, invariably recall conventional and decadent colonial Greek works of the same art form and design. It is here that we can trace the source of the impetus and inspiration of the conventional art of the crowning lions of Mauryan columns. Here, then, in a tradition familiar with the lions and bulls and horses, was the convention fixed and determined. It is difficult to say anything about the nationality of the artist of the Mauryan court. There is no evidence on the point, but from what has been said above, it is permissible to assume that the Dholi elephant, the Rampurva bull, and perhaps also the Sankasya elephant are works of Indian artists working in contemporary Indian style and tradition, and having a thorough mastery of the third dimension and a full consciousness of the Indian outlook. The crowning lions of the early phases, namely the Basra Bakhira and Lauria Nandangar examples, are also works of Indian artists, but tutored in the style and tradition of contemporary Western art. This is marked in the grappling with the problem of form and its precise execution evident in these sculptures. There is a decided advance in the Rampurva, Sarnath and Sanchi specimens. This may have been achieved by the same Indian artist working in the direction of contemporary Western art, or by colonial artists of the Hellenistic Orient imported by the Mauryan court. In any case, they are in these specimens a strong and undeniable Hellenistic stamp that may not have been imprinted by Indian hands. In sharing the credit for these masterpieces, it is felt that the symbolism and imagination, their spiritual message, so to speak, was supplied by the Indian mind, while most of the technical skill, together with certain decorative elements, were the work of imported craftsmen. But the brilliant polish which gives such a finality to the work was the result of Indian thought and labor, as there is evidence of an indigenous aptitude in this aspect of the stone cutter's art. Thus, the relationship of these edict pillars of Ashoka with those of Achaemenid Iran has often been stressed. The influence of West Asiatic factors in the art and culture of the period cannot be seriously denied in view of the close contact existing at this time between India and other West Asiatic countries. But it is rather difficult to regard the Mauryan pillars merely as imitations or adaptations of the Achaemenid prototypes. There are tangible differences between the two in their respective functions as well as in their conceptions and styles. Unfortunately, such differences have usually been ignored. Not belonging to any architectural composition, the function of the Mauryan pillars is totally different, a difference that is also reflected in their design and form. The Mauryan pillar, unlike Achaemenid, does not stand on any base, nor does it exhibit the channeling or fluting which is invariably characteristic of the latter. The shaft of the Mauryan pillar is, without exception, monolithic. The Achaemenian invariably composed of separate segments of stone aggregated one above the other. Again, in technique, the Mauryan pillar partakes the character of woodcarvers or carpenter's work, the Achaemenian that of a mason. Finally, the design as well as the shape of the capitals is different, due no doubt to the new conception of the Mauryan pillars as standing free in the space. The supposed resemblance of the so-called bell in the Indian pillar with that of Persepolitan is merely superficial. It should be remembered also that the member with which analogy is drawn usually appears in the Achaemenid column at the base and not as the capital. As in the Indian pillar, the double curves of the Indian member surmounted by animal sculpture in the round exemplify rather a new order of capital which is distinctive of India alone. This lotiform member representing either an inverted lotus or a Puranghata is entirely in accord with Indian tradition, and it would be futile not to recognize its Indian origin. The real affinities with the West are recognized in the use of such decorative motifs as the honeysuckle, the acanthus, the knop and flower pattern, etc. But in view of the wide divergence in form, design and conception, a borrowing from the Achaemenian pillar design cannot truly explain the Indo-Iranian affinities. India had long been a part of the West Asiatic cultural complex, and the key to the problem lies, as Kumaraswamy observes, in inheritance of common artistic traditions. Finally, we can conclude by saying that the indigenous and original contribution to the creation of this item of Mauryan art is therefore undeniable. Equally undeniable is also the fact that on their lustrous varnish, in their adoption and adaptation of the bell-shaped capital, in the higher place of conception and driving ideas, and in the journal monumental and dignified quality and appearance they exhibit, the Mauryan columns seem to reveal clearly the depth they owe to the Archimedean art as well as to the Hellenistic art, so far as the crowning member of the columns and the part of journal effect are concerned. The twisted rope design, the bead reel cable design, and so on to mark the transitions, the acanthus leaf and palmette and other designs to decorate abacus may have, however, been derived from the older and common West Asiatic art heritage. The unerring precision with which these Mauryan pillars were worked and chiseled show that those who quarried and carved them were no novices at their craft, as would have been Indian artificers, but had generations of experience behind them. The shapes and decorative forms employed are few of them indigenous, but on the other hand are obviously derived from the art repertoire of another and more advanced people. Such exotic forms are not difficult to identify, as some of them are clearly of Greek, others of Persia, and a few perhaps of Egyptian extraction. This development of the art of working in stone, therefore, which Ashoka introduced into the country, represents an Indian offshoot of that forceful Greco-Persian culture which flourished with such vigor in Western Asia some centuries before the Christian era. Thus, with this we come to the end of this lecture, and I believe that by now you all must have got a clear picture of these Mauryan pillars and the various differences and influences on them. Thank you.